Counselor Veth of the Searle Compact counted every one of them. She sat in her observation tier above the central floor of the conclave chamber and watched the words scroll across the great projection ring, each charge against the human species, rendered in the 63 recognized languages of the Galactic Conclave. And she felt something she had not expected to feel: discomfort. Not moral discomfort. She told herself that clearly. The resolution was lawful. The charges had been compiled through proper process, submitted by the Restoration Bloc's legal directorate, and certified by no fewer than 4 independent arbiters. The infractions were documented. The Naketh Accord violations were on record. The biological contamination events at Pelori Station and the Dusk Meridian Waypoint were photographed, sampled, and time-stamped. Humanity had been warned 3 times over 7 years. The case was airtight by any measure the Conclave recognized. What made Veth uncomfortable was the room. She had attended 412 full Conclave sessions across her 31 years of service. She knew what a deliberating body looked like, and she knew what a performing one looked like. Today, the 89 delegates below her were performing. The Restoration Bloc's lead arbiter, a Turvek named Tessic, read each charge with a specific cadence of someone who had rehearsed the pauses. The gallery observers leaned forward or backward in perfectly calibrated degrees of outrage or satisfaction, depending on their affiliations, as if someone had told them all in advance at what moments to react. It was not a deliberation. It was a verdict reading. The resolution passed to first certification with 61 votes in favor, 12 opposed, and 16 abstentions. To become binding, it needed 70 votes in favor at the second certification, which was scheduled in 48 standard hours. The bloc had been working the abstentions for 6 weeks. Veth's own vote was marked as undecided, and 3 of her compact colleagues had already signaled they would move to the affirmative column before the session ended. She pressed her knuckle against the edge of her data pad and did not mark anything. Below, Chesick concluded the reading, and the chamber filled with the dry, controlled applause that conclave delegates gave when they wanted to look enthusiastic without committing to a position publicly. Veth watched him step back from the speaker's floor and accept congratulations from 4 colleagues. And she noticed that he did not look at the far side of the chamber at all. She followed his non-gaze to a small sealed antechamber door, marked with the yellow and gray striping of observer admission. The human delegation had been permitted to attend as observers, non-voting, non-speaking. It was a conclave courtesy extended to species under active review, a tradition that dated back 1,200 years and had never once changed an outcome. Veth watched the door and waited to see what came out of it. The Terran Diplomatic Bureau had sent Petra Okafor. This was not the plan. The plan had been to send Ambassador Delvin Marchak, who had spent 9 years at the Conclave, who spoke 4 alien languages at functional conversational level, who had personal relationships with delegates from 6 different member species, and who had been specifically prepared for this session with 6 months of coalition analysis and 32 briefing documents. Marchak had been detained at the Pelori transfer hub 14 hours before his shuttle was scheduled to depart. The detention was technical in nature, relating to a documentation discrepancy in his passage credentials that had somehow appeared overnight. His legal team expected resolution in a minimum of 5 days, Petra Okafor was the Bureau's incident analyst attached to the Conclave Observer mission. She was not a diplomat. She had a background in post-conflict institutional review, which meant she had spent the better part of a decade flying to places where something had gone wrong and writing very precise reports about exactly how and why. She was 37 years old, had never addressed a body larger than a municipal council hearing, and had been on a different floor of the observer mission building, eating a sandwich, when the chief of mission knocked on her door and told her she was now the acting head of delegation. She had asked 3 questions. What was the exact charge in the resolution? What was the current vote count? And how many delegates were genuinely undecided versus performing undecided? The chief of mission had answers to the first 2. For the third, he said he did not know. Then that's where I start, Petra said, and went to finish her sandwich. She was not permitted to speak on the floor. She was not permitted to request private meetings through official channels without a 5-day application window, which she did not have. She was permitted to be present in the observer antechamber and to submit written communications to any delegate, which would be received and could be responded to at the delegate's discretion, with no requirement of reply. She had submitted exactly 1 communication before the session began. It was addressed to Councillor Veth of the Sorrel Compact, and it said, "I understand you have questions about Incident Report 44 from the Dusk Meridian event. I was the analyst who wrote it. I noticed 3 things in my own report that I believe were misread. I would value the chance to explain what I meant. Petra Okafor, Acting Terran Liaison." Veth received it on her datapad during the applause for Sessek's reading. She read it twice. She did not reply. But she also did not delete it, which was behavior Petra had anticipated, because the message had been written specifically for someone who would read it twice and not delete it. The antechamber door opened, and Petra stepped out into the lower public gallery as the session formally recessed. She was not remarkable to look at. Medium height, dark complexion, hair pulled back in a way that suggested function rather than presentation. She wore the gray-blue of Bureau Observer staff. She walked to the gallery rail and looked down at the chamber floor without any particular urgency. And Veth, still in her observation tier, watched her for approximately 40 seconds before realizing that she was doing it. She pressed her knuckle to her datapad and flagged the contact request as pending. Sessek appeared at her elbow within 30 seconds of the recess chime, which told Veth that he had been watching for her response. "The human's request," he said. "Still considering it," Veth said. "There is nothing to consider. She has no standing. She cannot address the conclave. Any private exchange serves only the Terran delegation's interests, and the resolution is already certified at first stage." "You are advising me not to speak to an observer," Veth said. "I am advising you that the appearance of deliberation at this stage undermines the seriousness of the certified charges." Veth turned and looked at him. "Then I will be careful about appearances," she said, and walked toward the gallery staircase. Sessek did not follow her, which was wise. Veth did not go directly to the public gallery. She went to the reference archive corridor on the chamber's east side and pulled the full text of Incident Report 44 from the Dusk Meridian biological event. She had read a summary before. Now she read the full thing. It was 312 pages. She did not read all 312 pages. She read the methodology section, the uncertainty appendix, and the conclusion. Then she read the conclusion again. Then she found the 3 passages that the Restoration Bloc's legal directorate had cited as evidence of deliberate contamination, and she read the original surrounding paragraphs that the citations had been pulled from. The original paragraphs said something different from what the citations implied. Not opposite, not exonerated, but genuinely different in scope and certainty. The analyst had flagged 2 of the 3 events as probable cause unknown, rather than probable cause human. But that flag was in an appendix notation, and the main conclusion paragraph had been written with a broad framing that made it easy to read as more definitive than it was. Veth sat with the document for 22 minutes, which made her 11 minutes late to the recess reception that her compact colleagues were attending. She received 4 messages asking where she was. She responded to none of them. She responded instead to Petra Okafor's message. She wrote, "Gallery Level 3, Eastern Reading Alcove, 15 minutes. Petra was already there when Veth arrived, which meant she had moved as soon as the reply came in. She was standing rather than sitting, not because she was anxious, but because she had been reading the chamber map on her datapad and had not found a reason to sit yet. She put the datapad away when Veth entered, and she did not lead with pleasantries. "Thank you for the time," Petra said. "I know how it spends right now." Veth settled into the reading alcove's single bench. "You wrote the report," she said. 3 years ago, yes. The block's legal directorate used it to support 2 of the 7 contamination charges. I know. I've been trying to figure out exactly how they read it, and I think I made an error in the conclusion framing. The events I flagged as uncertain in the appendix should have been flagged in the main body. When someone reads only the main conclusion, the uncertainty disappears. Veth studied her. "You are telling me your own report was flawed. I'm telling you it was imprecise. There is a difference. Flawed would mean the underlying data was wrong. The data holds. What I wrote about the data in the summary created a stronger impression of certainty than the evidence warranted. If I raise this in chamber, it would be heard as Terran advocacy." "Yes," Petra said. "That's not why I'm telling you. I'm not asking you to raise it in chamber. I'm telling you because you flagged your vote as undecided and you read the full report this afternoon, which means you were bothered by something specific. I want to know what it was, and I want to know if what I just told you is the thing that was bothering you, or if there's something else." Veth was quiet for a moment. Outside the alcove, the reception sounds filtered through, the low thrum of 70 species of ambient conversation, the soft chime of service units, the specific frequency of Turvek delegates speaking at higher volume than necessary. "The contamination events are the weakest charges," Veth said slowly. "The record-keeping violations and the border incident at Thren Passage are substantially stronger. If those 2 charges alone were the resolution, I would have no uncertainty. But the contamination events are what made it a capital matter," Petra said. "Yes. So you are uncertain whether humanity should be erased, or you are uncertain whether the evidence for the threshold charge is sufficient to authorize it." The distinction was clean and sharp, and it sat between them for a breath. "The second," Veth said. Petra nodded slowly. "That's also what I'm uncertain about," she said. "The record-keeping violations are real. The Thren Passage incident caused actual harm. I'm not here to argue that my species is innocent of everything on the charge sheet. I'm here because I believe 2 of the contamination citations are built on a reading of my report that I did not intend and that I can demonstrate is incomplete. Demonstrate how? I have the original field sampling data from both events. I have the chain of custody logs. I have the communications my team sent to the Conclave's own environmental bureau at the time, which were marked received and filed without any follow-up action for 16 months. I can show you the gap between what was submitted and what was acted on, and I can show you that in both cases, the source identification was listed as unresolved pending further review, not confirmed human origin. Veth set her datapad on her knee. Why are you giving this to me and not filing it as a formal counter-submission? Because a formal counter-submission takes 8 days to schedule for floor review, and I have 47 hours. And because you already read the report, which means you already wanted to know. I'm not selling you something. You were already buying. Veth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Send me the files." Chesick found out about the meeting through a delegate aide who had been passing the alcove. He brought it to the block's senior coordination meeting that evening, where 7 of the leading affirmative delegates reviewed the situation and concluded that Veth was a soft variable who needed to be managed. The management plan was straightforward. A personal visit from the block's most senior member, High Arbiter Donick, who had built his career on being the person in a room that other people felt reluctant to argue with. Donick requested a meeting with Veth at the 7th hour of the evening session break. He brought 2 aides and arrived 4 minutes early, which was a territorial move, and both of them knew it. "The resolution proceeds well," he said, before Veth had offered him a seat. "It proceeds quickly," Veth said. "Speed and quality are not in conflict when the evidence is clear." "I have been reviewing the evidence. The arbiters reviewed it thoroughly. That review took 14 months. "Then another evening should not trouble anyone," Veth said, and she did not look away from him. Donick shifted his weight. He was larger than most members of his species, which was part of what made him effective in rooms, and he used the space around him deliberately. "Counselor, I want to speak directly," he said. "There is no version of this review that produces new information. What there is the impression of doubt where certainty exists, and that impression weakens the entire framework of the Naketh Accord. Other species are watching. If the Conclave appears to waver when the evidence is documented and certified, the Accord becomes optional in the next challenge. That is a compelling argument for maintaining institutional confidence," Veth said. "It is not an argument about the specific evidence. The specific evidence is certified. Certifications have been revised before." Donick looked at her steadily. "The vote is in 46 hours. I would encourage you not to spend them in ways that suggest the Searle Compact is unreliable on security matters." He left without waiting for a response. Veth sat for a while after he left. Then she opened the files Petra had sent. The files were comprehensive in a specific way that bothered Veth initially. They were too well organized. The documentation was time-stamped, cross-referenced, and indexed, and the index included a section labeled "Items that do not help the Terran position," which contained 4 entries. Veth opened that section first. It contained an internal bureau memo from 18 months before the Thren Passage incident, suggesting that the sector patrol protocols were inadequate, which had been filed and not acted on. A record of a failed compliance review at Pelori Station that a Terran installation manager had signed off on incorrectly. A communications delay log showing that humanity's response to the first conclave warning had taken 9 days longer than the accord required. And a technical assessment from the Bureau's own environmental division acknowledging that one of the contamination samples shared genetic markers with organisms native to human-colonized space, though the chain of custody was contested. Veth read this section 3 times. It was not the behavior of someone building a legal defense. It was the behavior of someone who wanted the full picture to be seen, even the unflattering parts. She flagged the items and sent a message. The items in the self-adverse section. "Were you required to include those?" Petra replied within 4 minutes. "No. But if you're going to use any of this, you need to see them. If I only show you the things that support my argument, I'm doing to you what the Bloc did with my report." Veth sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up her formal request tablet and began drafting the paperwork for an emergency addendum to the resolution record, which was a procedural mechanism that allowed a voting delegate to attach supplementary documentation to the second certification vote, requiring all delegates to acknowledge its receipt before casting their ballot. It was not a block. It was not a reversal. It was a slowdown. 46 hours became 62 by rule. Every delegate would receive the supplementary package and have to formally confirm they had seen it before their vote would register. The filing took her until the second hour of the morning cycle. She submitted it at 3:47 and then went to sleep. Petra received the notification of the addendum filing at 4 in the morning, Conclave station time. She was awake. She read it and sat with the screen light in the dark of her temporary quarters for a while. She sent a message to Veth that said, "I saw it, thank you." Veth did not reply, which was also the right answer. The next morning, the Restoration Bloc filed a formal objection to the addendum on the grounds that supplementary documentation could not include materials originating with the party under review. This was technically correct as a matter of standard practice, though it was not specifically prohibited in the Conclave Charter. The objection was assigned to procedural arbiters for review. Petra had anticipated this. She had prepared for it at 2 in the morning by identifying the relevant charter passages and drafting a response she could not officially submit because she had no standing. What she could do was provide it to the Sural Compact's legal attaché, who had standing, and who received her transmission with visible confusion. And then, after reading it, with something approaching professional appreciation. The legal attaché's name was Marut, and he was thorough and careful in the specific way that legal professionals become when they have seen enough cases go wrong because someone skipped a step. He reviewed Petra's arguments for 40 minutes, checked the citations, found 2 that needed refinement, corrected them himself, and filed the response under the Compact's seal before the procedural arbiters had finished their preliminary review. When Tessik's office received notification of the Compact's filing, there was a pause of approximately 9 minutes in the official objection process, and then the Bloc withdrew its objection. The addendum stood. Petra and Marut met briefly in the corridor outside the filing office. He was angular and precise, moved with the efficiency of someone who had worked in institutions for many years, and he looked at her with something between assessment and irritation. "You anticipated the objection," he said. "I've read a lot of incident reports," Petra said. "They follow patterns. The charter citation you flagged in Section 12 is one that most practitioners miss. I had time to look carefully." He was quiet for a moment. "You should know that Counselor Veth did not consult me before filing the addendum. She filed independently." "I know," Petra said. "She took a significant institutional risk." "I know that too." He looked at her in a way she had learned to recognize in rooms where someone was recalibrating an assumption. It did not happen instantly. It was the kind of recalibration that looked like a small tightening around the eyes and a brief stillness. "The documentation you compiled," he said. "The self-adverse section. Yes, I've reviewed 340 cases before this conclave in my career. I have never seen a party under resolution submit self-adverse documentation voluntarily. I needed Counselor Veth to trust what I was showing her," Petra said. "You can't earn that by only showing the favorable side." Marut was quiet again. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Nothing right now," Petra said. "But if you have colleagues in other delegations who might be willing to receive the full documentation package, I'd rather they get it from you than from me." He considered this for a moment that was longer than it needed to be. "I'll see what is appropriate," he said, which was, from everything Petra had read about Sural Compact legal culture, a formal yes. The addendum was acknowledged by 63 delegates in the first 4 hours. The timeline extension reset the second certification clock. In those additional 16 hours, 6 things happened that the Restoration Bloc had not planned for. First, the Compact's legal attaché transmitted the full documentation package to 4 other delegations. 3 of them had been abstaining. 1 had been marked affirmative. Second, a science review council from the Ethani Collective quietly requested a copy of the original Dusk Meridian field sampling data, which Petra sent within the hour. The Ethani had 2 of their own environmental scientists aboard the Conclave station, and those scientists spent 12 hours reviewing the chain of custody records. Third, a Conclave archivist named Dawson, who had been present when the Environmental Bureau originally received the Terran contamination reports in Year 1, pulled the original filing receipts. The receipts showed that the reports had been flagged for priority review and then reassigned to a lower classification 3 days later, at a time when 2 of Sessik's former aides had been seconded to the Environmental Bureau's filing division. Dawson brought this to Veth's office. He was not required to do this. He had been bothered by it for a while. Fourth, Petra made an error. She was reviewing the documentation in preparation for a possible formal floor appearance request, which she still did not have standing to make, when she sent a transmission intended for Marut to the wrong recipient address. The transmission contained her full analysis of the vote count and which delegates she believed were genuinely persuadable versus which were committed regardless of evidence. The recipient was a delegate aide in the Restoration Bloc's communication office. She realized the error within 6 minutes. She sent an immediate recall and correction message. She also sent a direct message to Sessik's office acknowledging the error and confirming that no deliberate distribution had been intended. Sessik's response was to forward the accidentally transmitted analysis to every voting delegate with a cover note accusing the Terran Observer delegation of running an unauthorized influence campaign. The message reached the floor at the 14th hour of the extended window. Petra was in Veth's outer office when the notification hit. She read it. She sat down and looked at the floor for a long moment. Then she said to Veth's aide, "I need to speak with Counselor Veth directly. Please tell her it's about a mistake I made." Veth came out of her inner office in under a minute. Petra told her exactly what had happened, in the same sequence it had occurred. She did not minimize the error, did not blame the addressing system, and did not suggest that Tessik's use of the accidental transmission was the primary issue. She said she had made a mistake, and it had been exploited, and she needed to know if it had damaged anything that mattered. Veth listened to all of it. Then she said, "Do you still believe your analysis of the vote count is accurate?" "Yes," Petra said. "Then the only thing that has changed is that Tessik now also believes it is accurate." Petra looked at her. "He'll use it to lock his affirmative commitments before they can reconsider." "Yes, he has approximately 12 hours to do that." Veth was quiet for a moment. "You sent him a correction and an acknowledgement of the error. Within 6 minutes. That acknowledgement is on the record. It doesn't undo the distribution. No, but it is evidence of something specific. And if I were a delegate who had just received both Tessik's forward and your correction in the same hour, I would be asking myself which one of them was more interested in the accurate picture and which was more interested in the useful one." Veth picked up her formal request tablet. "Go and sleep for 3 hours. You are going to need to be coherent for the morning session." Petra stood. "Counselor, if the vote goes against us, I want you to know that what you did with the addendum was right, regardless of the outcome." Veth did not look up from the tablet. "The outcome is not final," she said. "Go sleep." The morning session opened with the second certification vote on the schedule for the afternoon. The chamber was at full attendance, which was unusual. Even delegates who typically attended by proxy had come in person. The gallery above was filled. Tessik opened with a procedural motion to disqualify the addendum on the grounds of the accidental transmission, arguing that it demonstrated the Terran Observer delegation had been operating in bad faith. This was a substantial stretch of the disqualification criteria, and everyone in the room knew it. But it was on the floor, which meant it had to be addressed, which ate time. Marut filed a counter motion, citing the immediate correction and acknowledgement. He argued for 9 minutes, precisely and without flourish. The presiding arbiter, a Veth-aged official named Osal, who had the particular demeanor of someone who had been watching bodies like this one for too long to be impressed by any of it, ruled against Tessik's motion in 7 sentences. Tesik sat down. He did not look at Veth. He looked at the floor, which was how Petra had learned to identify when the Restoration Bloc was recalculating rather than reacting. The Ythani Collective's environmental scientists submitted a brief through their delegation. An informal note, not a formal counter-evidence submission, stating that their preliminary review of the dusk meridian sampling data found the chain of custody documentation to be incomplete with respect to 2 of the 3 contamination events cited, and that they would welcome a more thorough review before treating those events as confirmed in origin. It was not an exoneration. It was a flag. but it was from an independent scientific body with no stake in the outcome. And when it hit the floor, 3 of the delegates who had been listed as affirmative in Petra's accidentally distributed analysis shifted their vote indicators to undecided. The Restoration Bloc's count moved from 61 to 58. Cesic was on his feet immediately with a procedural challenge to the Ythani note's admissibility. Ossel allowed it. Cesic argued that informal scientific correspondence could not alter certified findings. Ossel agreed that it could not alter them and ruled that it had not been submitted to alter them. Only to note, Cesic sat down again. Veth had not spoken yet. She had been sitting with her hands folded and watching the room, and Petra, from the observer antechamber window, had been watching her in the same way. The gallery above had gone very quiet. At the 15th minute of the morning session, the presiding arbiter announced that under the rules governing second certification, any voting delegate could request a 48-hour extension of the certification window if they presented documented grounds for believing that material evidence had not been fully evaluated. This was a rule that had been used exactly twice in Conclave history. The grounds required were substantial. Veth stood. The room went more quiet than it had been. She said that she was requesting the extension on the following documented grounds: that the supplementary addendum submitted by the Sural Compact contained primary source field data from 2 of the charged contamination events, that an independent scientific body had flagged incomplete chain of custody documentation in those same events within the last 12 hours, that the procedural history of those reports' original filing with the Conclave's Environmental Bureau contained irregularities that had not been present in the certified arbiter's review, and that the threshold charge authorizing capital action was in material part based on those 2 events. She set her documentation on the record feed and sat down. The room held still for a moment that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long time in a body that conducts itself at high speed. Cesic rose. He stated that the irregularities Veth referred to were a matter of administrative history, with no bearing on the established findings. He stated that delay at this stage served only the Terran delegation's tactical interests. He stated that the extension mechanism was designed for incomplete evidentiary review, not for politically motivated reconsideration. He was persuasive. He was practiced. He had spent decades in rooms exactly like this one. Ossel listened to him without expression, which was his normal state. Then he turned to Cesic and said, "The irregularities in the Environmental Bureau filing history, are they on record?" Cesic said, "They are a matter of administrative process, not evidentiary weight." "Are they on record?" Ossel said again, flatly. A pause. "Yes," Cesic said. "Were they included in the material reviewed by the certifying arbiters?" Another pause, longer. "The arbiters reviewed the contamination events as documented." "That is not what I asked," Ossel said. He turned back to the floor. "The extension request is granted. The second certification window is extended by 48 hours. The Environmental Bureau filing irregularities are formally referred to the Conclave's Internal Review Office for expedited examination. This session is recessed." The gavel came down. The next 48 hours were not quiet, but they were different from the hours before them. The Internal Review Office moved quickly because Ossel had written expedited on the referral. and his word carried specific weight in that office. They pulled the original filing records for the Dusk Meridian and Pelori Station reports. They pulled the personnel assignment records for the Environmental Bureau's filing division for the relevant period. They found that the reassignment from priority to low classification had been initiated by a temporary secondee who had since moved to a post outside Conclave jurisdiction, and that the secondee had shared professional history with 2 members of Sussex staff. This finding was not proof of deliberate interference. The review office's report said exactly that, explicitly and twice. But it was a documented irregularity with a documented potential pathway, and it was now in the official record. The Ythani environmental scientists completed their preliminary review and submitted a formal note, this time through official channels. They concluded that the chain of custody for the Dusk Meridian events was insufficient to support confident source identification. They did not find that humanity was not the source. They found that the record did not firmly establish that it was. Petra spent most of the 48 hours in the observer mission offices, not sending messages and not attending anything. She answered questions when people had them, provided documents when they were requested, and did not interpret any of it for the delegations who were receiving it. She had spent 3 years writing reports precisely because she understood that the moment you started telling people what to conclude from evidence, the evidence became secondary. The evidence had to speak without a narrator telling you how to feel about it. That was the discipline. It was uncomfortable to hold to, especially now. At hour 11 of the extension, she received a message from a delegate aide representing the Thren Passage incident's primary affected party, the Veloci Shipping Consortium. It was not a warm message. It noted that the amended resolution framework, if adopted, would include a reparation structure, and it asked whether the Terran Observer mission was prepared to cooperate with the assessment process. Petra wrote back within 10 minutes. She said yes, fully, and included a summary of the Bureau's own damage assessment of the Thren Passage incident, which had been conducted internally, and which assessed the harm at a figure 20% higher than the consortium's claim. The aide did not respond for 6 hours. When the response came, it was 3 words: "We will note." Petra took that as a reasonable outcome and moved on. Merut stopped by the observer mission on the second afternoon. He brought a colleague from the Ythani legal staff with him, a young official named Sithari, who had clear eyes and asked precise questions. They reviewed the chain of custody materials together for 2 hours, and Petra answered everything they asked and flagged twice when a question had 2 possible interpretations to make sure she understood which one they meant. Sithari worked methodically. He would read a document, note a question, wait for Petra's answer, then make a note, then read another section. He did not accept incomplete answers. When Petra cited a source document, he pulled it and verified the citation before moving on. This was slow, and it was correct, and Petra did not rush him once. At one point, he found a discrepancy between 2 lab timestamps in the Dusk Meridian sampling record. The discrepancy was 7 minutes, and it was between the sample collection log and the transport registration, which would be normal in field conditions, where the sample collector and the transport officer were different individuals recording separately. Petra explained this. Sithari asked if there was any documentation of that standard practice. There was. Petra found it in the original field team protocol document, which she had, and she sent it to him, and he verified it, and they moved on. But the fact that he had asked and that she had been able to answer with documentation rather than assertion mattered. It mattered in the way that every small demonstration of precision matters when you were trying to establish that you were the kind of party who can be believed. At the end of the review, Satheri said, "If the filing irregularities had been found during the original arbitration, the threshold contamination charges would not have been certified as capital." "That's my reading," Petra said. "Your reading has a conflict of interest." "Yes," Petra said. "That's why I'm glad you read it too." Sathari looked at Marut. Something passed between them that Petra could not fully read, which was, she reflected, appropriate. They were not her read to make. They were their own. "The other charges," Marut said to Petra. "The Naketh Accord, record-keeping violations, the Thren Passage incident. You have not submitted any counter-documentation for those." "No," Petra said. "Why?" "Because they're real," Petra said. "Humanity violated the Accord's reporting requirements twice. The Thren Passage Patrol caused direct harm to a Veloci transport that had right-of-way. Those are documented, and I believe the documentation is accurate." Marut was still. "You are aware that admitting to those violations while contesting the capital threshold charges creates a specific legal situation." "I'm aware. If the Conclave removes the capital charges and the resolution becomes a formal censure and compliance mandate, humanity will have to accept it, including the reparations framework for Thren Passage." "That is a significant concession." "It's an accurate one," Petra said. "I'm not trying to get my species off the hook. I'm trying to make sure the hook we're on is the right size for what we actually did." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was long. Sathari was looking at the table. Marut was looking at Petra. Outside the observer mission windows, the Conclave station's interior ring was cycling through its afternoon light shift, the panels transitioning from the blue-white of working hours to the slightly warmer tone that indicated late session period, and the corridor beyond the windows filled briefly with the end-of-shift movement of hundreds of staff from dozens of species, all doing the same ordinary thing at the same ordinary time. "I need to make some calls," Marut said, and he and Sathari left together, and Petra sat in the observer mission common room and drank cold coffee and waited. The second certification session convened at the scheduled hour. The gallery was even more full than before. 3 delegations that had not sent observers to the original session had sent them now. Chesick was present. He sat in his assigned position with the particular stillness of someone who had recalculated and found a position they could defend. The Internal Review Office submitted its report. It was read into the record in full. The finding regarding the secondee and the filing reclassification was noted. The reviewer stated clearly and on the record that deliberate interference had not been established, only that the irregularity existed and had not been reviewed by the original arbiters. Veth did not speak immediately. 2 other delegates did, and then the chamber sat in an unusual moment of extended silence that Ossel allowed to run for 11 seconds before asking if any delegate had a motion. Sesic rose. He proposed that the second certification vote proceed on the original resolution text. He argued that the review findings were inconclusive and did not change the underlying documented charges. He argued that Terminus Resolution 7 remained the appropriate response to a cumulative pattern of violations that had persisted across multiple warnings and multiple years. He was measured and controlled, and he made a case that could not be dismissed. The floor opened. 4 delegates spoke, 2 for the resolution as written, and 2 raising concerns about the threshold evidence. The abstaining delegates were sitting with their vote indicators dark. Veth rose. "I am not going to argue that humanity's record before this conclave is clean," she said. "It is not. The record-keeping violations are real. The Thren Passage incident caused real harm. A resolution addressing those violations and requiring remediation is appropriate. What I am arguing is that this specific resolution, in its current form, authorizes capital action based on a threshold charge that the record does not support to the required standard." Sesek said, "The certification was completed." The certification was completed before the chain of custody irregularities were identified and before the filing reclassification was found, Veth said. Certifications are not immune to new material. If they were, the extension mechanism would not exist. She paused and let that sit for a moment. "I am moving to amend the resolution," she said. "Remove the capital action provisions, retain the censure, retain the compliance mandate, retain the reparations framework for Thren Passage, require humanity to submit to a compliance monitoring program under conclave supervision for 5 years. That is a substantial consequence. That is a consequence I can support because the evidence supports it." Sesek immediately called for a vote against the amendment. The vote on the amendment went to the floor. 22 seconds passed, during which vote indicators moved across the board. The amendment passed. 53 in favor, 29 opposed, 7 abstentions. The amended resolution went to second certification. It passed 61 to 15, with 13 abstentions. The capital provisions of Terminus Resolution 7 were removed from the record. Humanity was not erased. Humanity was censured, monitored, and required to make reparations for what it had actually done. The chamber did not erupt. It was a conclave session, not a stadium. What happened was that the vote indicators settled, and the presiding arbiter read the result into the official record, and the session closed with the standard chime. And then the room began to move and fill with the particular noise of people who had been holding their breath in various ways and had just stopped. Petra was watching from the antechamber. She heard the chime and sat down and looked at her hands. She did not feel triumphant exactly. The reparations framework was substantial. The monitoring program would be intrusive and politically uncomfortable on Earth for years. The Accord violations were on the permanent record and would affect trade negotiations and border access for at least a decade. None of that was resolved. None of it was gone. What was gone was the piece that should not have been there. She sent a message to the chief of mission. It said, "Resolution amended, capital provisions removed, full report to follow." She put her datapad away and walked out into the corridor. Veth found her in the corridor 20 minutes later. The delegate was not demonstrative in the way that some species are after consequential moments, and Petra had already understood that about her, so she did not expect anything particular. They walked together toward the East Gallery staircase. "The monitoring program will have teeth," Veth said. "The Compliance Council will not be lenient." "Good," Petra said. You understand that the Thren Passage reparations will be calculated at maximum assessed value. There is no negotiation built into the framework. I read the framework. It's fair. Veth was quiet for a few steps. The Internal Review Office will continue its examination of the filing irregularities. If deliberate interference is established, Sessik's legal directorate will face a separate proceeding. That's for the Conclave to handle, Petra said. Not my business. You are not curious about the outcome. Extremely curious, Petra said, but it's not mine. Veth made a sound that Petra's translator rendered as a short exhalation with a slight descending tone, which was the closest equivalent in Sural compact communication to a dry acknowledgement of something accurate. Your ambassador was detained at Pelori, she said. Yes. The timing was specific. Yes. You were not the intended representative. No, Petra said. I was what was available. They reached the staircase. Veth stopped and looked at her in a way that was direct and not unkind. You are aware that if you had been a diplomat, you would likely have approached this differently. Probably, Petra said. Diplomats build relationships over years. I had 48 hours and no standing. I could only do what I knew how to do. Which is, read the room, find the thing that was actually wrong, and show it to the person who was already bothered by it. Veth considered this. The self-adverse documentation section, she said. That was the moment. I thought it might be, Petra said. You'd already read the full report. That told me you were looking for the accurate picture, not just the favorable one. If I showed you only what helped us, you'd have known I wasn't giving you the whole thing. And then nothing else I showed you would have mattered. You gambled on my being the kind of person who would respond to that. I read you, Petra said. I thought I was right. I got lucky that I was. Veth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the 5-year monitoring program will require a Terran liaison to interface with the Compliance Council on a quarterly basis. The role is advisory, but substantive. If the Bureau is selecting that liaison, I would suggest they consider someone with post-conflict institutional review experience. Petra looked at her. That would be a significant amount of shuttle travel. It would, Veth said. I'd need to review the role parameters. Of course, Veth said, and she walked up the staircase, and there was nothing more said. Dawson, the archivist, filed his report on the filing records 4 days after the session. It was thorough, careful, and 12 pages long, and it reached the conclusion that the reclassification was not consistent with standard procedure, and that the evidence was suggestive of external influence without being conclusive of it. The report was marked for the Internal Review Office and 3 senior arbiters. It was also marked in a small notation at the end, with a reference to the submission date of the original contamination reports and a comparison to the reclassification date, which Dawson noted for completeness and without editorial comment. The Internal Review Office began formal proceedings against 2 former Bureau employees the following month. Sessik himself was not named in those proceedings and was not expected to be for some time, if ever. Institutional accountability moves at the speed of institutional documentation, and both of those things are slow. But the proceedings existed, which was a different fact than they had not existing. The Restoration Bloc's influence in the Conclave did not collapse. It was not expected to. The bloc held legitimate positions on species security and border integrity that a substantial portion of Conclave members shared. and a single amended resolution did not change the underlying pressures that had made the resolution possible. What changed was more specific. 7 delegates who had been reliable, affirmative votes for bloc motions began asking more questions. Not different questions necessarily, just more of them. The pattern was noted in a political analysis report by a conclave observer think tank 6 weeks later, and the report used the term evidentiary standard normalization to describe what had shifted, which was accurate, if somewhat airless, as a description of the actual event. The Ythani environmental scientists published their chain of custody analysis in a peer-reviewed setting. It was picked up by 3 conclave-affiliated science bodies and cited in subsequent environmental review guidelines. This had not been asked for or expected. It was a consequence, not a plan. Marut sent Petra a formal message 3 weeks after the session. It was brief and precisely worded, and said that the Searle Compact's legal office found the documentation practices of the Terran Observer mission, specifically the indexing and attribution methodology, to be of notable quality, and that if the Bureau was open to it, a technical exchange on documentation standards might be of mutual benefit. Petra forwarded it to the Chief of Mission and suggested that yes, it probably would be, and that they should say so. Ambassador Marchak returned to the conclave station 2 weeks after the session. His documentation discrepancy had been resolved. He reviewed everything that had happened in his absence and then sat across from Petra in the Observer Mission conference room for 40 minutes, asking questions, not as a superior reviewing a subordinate's work, but as a practitioner genuinely examining a case. At the end, he said, "The self-adverse section." "Yes," Petra said. "That's what turned it." "I think so." He was quiet. "I wouldn't have thought of that," he said. It was not self-criticism. It was honest professional assessment. "I'd have led with the strongest counter-argument and defended every position, because that's the diplomatic mode. It's a good mode most of the time," Petra said. "It was the wrong mode for this room." "Maybe. Or maybe you'd have read the room the same way I did. I don't know. I only know what I did." Marchak looked out the window at the conclave station's exterior ring, where 17 species of maintenance workers were moving along the hull in their various pressure suits. The particular organized chaos of a working institution that had been running for longer than recorded human history. "The monitoring program starts in 6 months," he said. "You've been suggested as liaison." "I've been informed," Petra said. "It'll be a difficult assignment. The Compliance Council will not be looking for reasons to be lenient, and Earth's domestic politics around it will be uncomfortable." "Yes." "Do you want it?" Petra thought about the room in the conclave chamber, and Veth reading the full report at her tiered desk while the reception chimed below her, and Dosen pulling filing records because something had been bothering him, and Marut correcting 2 citations and filing under the compact's seal, because the argument was sound and the process deserved it. She thought about the specific texture of a room where the outcome is already decided, but one person has started to read more carefully. "I'll take it," she said. "The Galactic Conclave is a machine made from disagreement. It runs on the grinding friction of 812 member species who have different definitions of harm, different thresholds for evidence, different histories with each other, and different convictions about what kind of future they are building. It makes decisions the way large institutions always do, imperfectly, slowly, subject to the currents of whoever has the most consistent momentum at any given moment. What stopped humanity from being erased was not a speech. It was not a heroic act. It was a woman who read a room and found the one person who was already looking for the accurate picture, and showed that person what the picture actually contained, including the parts that hurt. That is less dramatic than it sounds and more difficult than it sounds, in equal measure. The instinct in high-pressure moments is to present the strongest case, to lead with everything that helps and manage everything that doesn't. The instinct is understandable and almost always wrong when the person you need to reach is already suspicious that you're doing it. The cost of honesty in those situations is that you cannot control what happens next. You give someone the whole picture, and you lose the ability to guide how they read it. You trust the picture to do what a picture does, which is show what is there. Veth read the picture. She made a decision at personal and institutional cost because the picture told her something the room was not saying. That was hers. Petra gave her the material, and the rest was Veth's. The 5-year monitoring program produced, in its second year, a jointly developed compliance framework that was later adopted as a conclave standard for species under corrective review. It was built by the Terran liaison and the Sural Compact's legal attaché, and 2 Ythani environmental technicians working in a small conference room over 14 months. None of whom were in any sense important figures. None of whom were in any story anyone was watching. All of whom were bothered by imprecision and took the time to do better. That also counts. It counts a great deal. If this kind of story holds something for you, if you are the kind of person who finds meaning in the small, accurate thing done in a difficult room, then you already know what it is. These stories keep going because the people who read them want them to. That's the whole mechanism, and it works because of you.